Hi, in this session we will talk about enterprise architecture modeling guidelines. This session will help us create good enterprise architecture models. To do so, we discuss the act of modeling as a goal-driven activity, the role of stakeholders as well as modeling process in general. We also assume that you are familiar with the Archimate Enterprise Architecture Modeling tool. Two architects without a common method tend to develop different models of the same real world. How should we decide which one is the good architecture? Pioneers in the design of complex systems have described design principles to ensure the conceptual integrity of the model. It is not enough to learn the elements and rules of combinations. One must also learn idiomatic usage and a whole lure of how the elements are combined in practice. To ensure the conceptual integrity, one can use subordinate design principles such as do not link what is independent or do not introduce multiple functions and do not introduce what is irrelevant and so on. So there are some rules around how these tools are used and how the elements are get together in order to achieve a comprehensively good design and a good design based on the standard acceptable standard. So as we say, there's a good, bad, and ugly. There is no such a thing as an inherently good or inherently bad model. As for modeling process, a model in a context of its unit is an unambiguous abstraction or abstract conception of some parts or aspects of a real world. In enterprise architecture, modeling typically involves creating abstract representations of enterprise. Architecture models are created in order to communicate something. Therefore, the model that is the result of the modeling process is not the ultimate goal and not even the only product of the process. Transformation is the knowledge, agreement, and commitments in the minds of the people involved are as important as the artifact itself, if not more important than that. Then the representation or the model, so the goal underlying the modeling process are essentially knowledge goals, and model should be directly aimed to fulfill those knowledge goals. Knowledge goals guidelines here shows that how it refers to the meta model and the concepts that the modelers work with it. As modeling progresses, the participants may or may not decide that more or different meta concepts are needed to answer the questions that are asked. For example, they may decide to start using the concept service or specialization of that concept fit for their specific modeling context. Therefore, the knowledge goals steer the modeling process, or should do so. Of course, these goals depend on the modeling context itself. In terms of basic modeling activities, the real-life modeling processes are not linear, but iterative and highly interactive. An architect will discuss design decisions in intermediate versions of the model with various stakeholders, and as a result repeats some activities, performing activities in a different order and combining or even skipping some of those activities. So what we need to do is to establish a purpose, a scope and a focus for the modeling. Modeling is a goal-driven activity, as I said before. So initially, an architect should determine who the stakeholders are and what the purpose of the model is in relation to these stakeholders. We have to decide on scope and focus of the model. For example, what parts of reality will be described in this model. For example, a primary process or a secondary process, or so on. And also we need to determine what aspects will be described and how. The other question we need to ask is with what level of details we want to develop this model. Note that models can be applied to describe the current situation, or as it's famously said, as is situation, as well as the situation is called to be situation, which is the goal architecture, possible including the required transition from as is to be. So to do that, we select one or more viewpoints to create the model. Architects create models using viewpoints. These viewpoints give a set of concepts and relations to be used during the modeling process. As such, they guide you in determining what information should be included in the model, given that the stakeholder, the purpose for which the model is created, and the focus. We also create and structure the model. In this stage, we gather the required information and create structure and visualize the enterprise architecture model. The action of creating and structuring a model are strongly related and should not be performed in isolation. As a sub-step of this, we need to consider enterprise architecture is hardly even performed in a greenfield situation. So typically business process models, information models, or infrastructure models about in the enterprise already exist. A main objective of enterprise architecture is to reveal the relations between the different domains and to provide a high-level overview. You can elicit the additional information. You need, for example, by using interviews or by discussing scenarios of situations of future architecture goal, which we call to be goal, with various stakeholders. We also base it on this information. You create the structure, create and structure a model. The purpose of structuring the model is to reduce its visual complexity, which makes it easier to recognize and understand. Structuring a model also helps to discover recurring patterns as well as inconsistencies. There are many ways to structure models. One type is which is frequently applied in enterprise modeling, is to structure the model around one key concept. For example, structuring your model around a concept service. Another type of structuring frequently used is business process descriptions that reveal the flow of process that are triggered by an event or an activity. In our approach, we create a model via one or more visual representations in accordance with the selected viewpoint. We have to decide, depending on the modeling purpose and the stakeholders, what visual representations to apply for the various concepts and relations, how to structure the visualization, and for instance what colors to use, and so on. Visualizing the model depending on the type of stakeholder and their needs. You select one or more appropriate ways to visualize the model. The enterprise architecture approach presented in this session advocates one central model which is visualized in different ways for different purposes. In other words, for different stakeholders. Maintaining the model, when you're maintaining the model, a modeling process is, we know that a modeling process is iterative. In the early stages of modeling, we discuss intermediate but stable versions of our model with stakeholders. These iterations help in getting a clear understanding of the purpose of the model or modeling process, the concerns of the individual stakeholders, and the degree of which the model helps in achieving these purposes. Now we discuss the type of modeling actions. So what kind of actions we take while we are modeling. There are virtually endless number of ways in which an enterprise architecture can go about creating or changing the contents of a model. There are a limited number of basic general types of modeling actions that can be distinguished with respect to the details actions we perform while modeling. These actions describe these type of modeling actions, thereby providing a vocabulary for talking and reasoning about how concepts and relations are handled during the modeling. To do so, number one, we introduce the candidate element in the model. So we get an element and we create that element. By this, we mean simply the act of placing a fresh term for the concept or relation within the element. Then we refine an element in the model. This corresponds to adding a detail to the element. Be aware that a model can, of course, also be refined by introducing elements. Refining an element can take two main forms. One is to classify the newly introduced element. You classify a yet unclassified element, or may have thought of a more specific classification or simply a better one. We also provide a description of the element in another way, then adding more elements, for instance by adding internal details to an element. For example, add attributes to a business object, or cardinality to a used by relation. Write a definition or a gloss kept outside the model. For example, in dictionary, why this instance of expressions expressing the definition by modeling it? Why define it at all? Will anyone, including yourself as an architect, ever read the definition? Nesting the model, by that we mean elaborate on an element by introducing another model. Zooming in or zooming out is the way you do that. We should consider why not including those details in the actual model. What is the reason for using multiple levels in your model? So these are the questions you need to answer before committing to nesting the model. Other type of modeling action is abandoning a model element. This is an action that is harder and more complex than it may look. You cannot just delete something straightforward. Of course, concepts and relations can be simply scrapped and deleted if they turn out to be wrong. However, especially if a model has been around for a while, it may be a good idea to make an explicit decision to abandon a concept or relation in order to avoid the concept lingering around some other parts of some other models. Another thing we do as part of modeling action, we do abstract from concept or relations. Importantly, this action is quite different from abandoning concepts or scrapping some details. Abstraction rather is the opposite of refinement. Abstraction can take place at two levels: abstract the whole concept or relation, or some internal details. In either case, you decide that some information that is available to you is to be left out of the model. You may want to keep the information but hide it. The trick here is to show the information on demand. Okay, so you show enough information that is necessary. Another type of action is to translate an element. Translation may, of course, simply mean refining a fitting alternative for an interested element in another model. If so, there is no crucial difference with introduction or refinement. However, an act of translation has its own special rationale behind it. More importantly, it may need to be documented in order to keep track of the existing relationships between model and context. Also, a further translation may have to be kept in line with previous translations. This is why we distinguish the following types: create or replace element, so it matches the meaning of the concept from another language or context. Answer these questions: why use the translation, why this translation, why from that particular source model context or language. Link an element to an element in the other model or modeling language. It keeps some records of this particular link and the particular context and or language to it concerns. Link an element to some intermediary language. This is an old trick in translation. If a model needs to be translated to more than one language or context, it may be a problem to find translators with expertise in all combinations of context or language. Instead, you could first translate to a language or context that is understood by everyone and then take the next step. A translation rule may be specified that enables the standardized coherent translation between some context or language. If translation is structural, this may be a good thing to do. However, a note of caution is in order here. So translation is a heavily contextualized and subtle business. If translation rules are too generally applied, gross misunderstand or mistranslation may occur. Based on experience in previous translations or in confusion between context and languages, sources of confusion may be listed explicitly. For example, harmoniums and synonyms, these may be part of the translation rule. But even if no such a rule are formulated, particularly notorious risks may be noted and communicated. We also look at document modeling action, and this is just another action of modeling. While this will often be too much of a burden, documentation and administration of all or some modeling actions may be useful. As such, we can do things such as to be able to undo. You may simply regret a decision and back off. To revise rejected alternatives, or to record modeling rationales related to traceability, accountability, etc. You can also be able to add conceptual metadata. It may be interesting to keep track of who did what with the model elements and where it occurs, in which language, context, model is the element used, is it part of any standard, who first introduced the element, and so on. These are the things that are really good to know about it. Next thing I'll talk about is guidelines for modeling. This economy of communication is an example of a literature by Grice Maxims in 1975. These maxims have been formulated as heuristics for optimizing communications. Since the visualization of an enterprise architecture model is a means to communicate information about an architecture or enterprise architecture, these maxims are relevant for us as well. Okay, so we looking at a model has to provide answers to the questions, make a clear distinction between a model and its visualization, architects have a tendency to consider visualization of a model as the model itself, so we shouldn't be using visual terms while describing a model. Okay, so applying this is good for us. For example, Maximov quantity, make your model as informative as possible. Do not make your model more informative than necessary. Do not make models what you believe to be false. Do not model that for which you lack adequate evidence. If you don't have an evidence, don't do it. Other things such as be relevant, model things related to the modeling goal, so it should be relevant. Okay, I'll just list those. If you apply these maxims, they will help you create models that include appropriate details given the modeling goal and the target stakeholder. Okay. Apart from the enterprise architecture, possible stakeholders including managers, CIOs, CEOs, software developers, and business process designers. In such setting, the type of stakeholders and the purpose for which the model is created determines what makes an appropriate model. Therefore, this model has to be created iteratively. When modeling an enterprise architecture, use several iterations to discuss intermediate stable models with stakeholders. Model for dynamics means that models often include real-time aspects that are likely to change over time, such as a company's product portfolio and so on. As such, models are dynamic. If certain changes can be foreseen, architects should add a description of how the model can change. Be economical in model. means that model only those concepts that relates or you know that are relevant given the purpose of the model and the type of stakeholders. Be economical in the view as well. When communicating with specific stakeholders, use the view of the model that only includes the concept and relations that are relevant for that particular stakeholder. Indicate concepts in a model by the same name the stakeholders apply to those concepts. So make sure the stakeholders understand your model. Make structure recognizable. Use the same type of structuring that the stakeholders apply. If the stakeholder, for instance, describes their businesses in terms of process with various steps, make sure these processes and individual steps are clearly presented in the model. So your model is for the stakeholders. So it should use all the concepts and all the concepts familiar to the particular stakeholder. Make model as consistent. Okay, keep related models consistent. In many cases, architects will create series of related models to model different concepts of the same enterprise. Coherence between these models is really important, and they need to everything, elements, concepts, everything between these models should be consistent. Make model as correct as and complete as is needed. A model should be a correct representation of something from the real world. Focus on specific aspects. While modeling abstractions or modeling an abstract form certain aspects, the aspect they focuses on should be modeled in a correct and complete manner. Treat different I talked about that. Treat different concerns orthogonally. Different concerns should be addressed in different parts of the model or in different related models. Okay, what do we do before you start? When you're about to start creating a model, for example, you are about to model an enterprise architecture, you should ask yourself the following questions, okay, before you start. Is there a clear stakeholder? Is there an objective explicit? Does the model help reach this objective? Are the boundaries clear of what you should model? Okay, so you know everything exactly where you're standing. Is it clear whether the situation as is or the situation to be should be modeled? Okay, so are you modeling the current situation or are you modeling the target in architecture? Can you obtain the information needed to create the model? Okay, do you have enough information? Do you have your requirements in hand? If not, you talk to stakeholders, interview people. Are there realistic expectations regarding your role as an enterprise architecture in the process? Now that you know all of these and you ticked all these boxes, we talk about what to capture for the model. So, okay, so now you wanted to start the model. Okay, what are the information you need to capture in order to start modeling? Select a design viewpoint, okay, that matches your objective. In deciding the scope of the model, you should focus only on those aspects that contribute to the modeling objective. Neglect matters of secondary importance and exceptions, okay, at the beginning, of course. So at the beginning, only do the things that you are 100% sure that are relevant. Initially assume that no errors occur on the process you are modeling, and that all processes completely successful. Discuss stable, intermediate versions of your model with the stakeholders. Things such as what to include in a model is determined by its purpose and stakeholders, of course. Start modeling from single element. Depending on the selected design viewpoint, one element, for instance, a specific role, a service, a process, or a product, which is of a prime importance in terms of a business. Form your model around this central element by going inwards toward the element composition of the element. So, okay, what actually makes up this element? If it's a product, has parts. If it's something else, if it's a service, has sub-services, things like that. Then upwards, the element that are supported by it, okay? So this is about every other element that depends on this element that you are modeling, okay? So this is which elements they are supporting, which element this current element is supporting is going upward. Downwards, it's a realization by other elements, okay? So is this an abstract and other elements will be realizing this? Also sideways, are there peer elements with which it cooperates, okay? So this is a illustration of the list. Okay, so so far in summary, if I put it in a few sentences, modeling is a goal-driven process in which an enterprise architect in cooperation with stakeholders creates and structures a model via one or more viewpoints. Enterprise architecture models are created for many reasons. They may, for instance, form a basis for design, for deciding or for informing stakeholders. Depending on the purpose and the stakeholders, an enterprise architect can choose from a wide range of tools and techniques to create an appropriate model. In this session, the stages in a model process have been described, as well as important principles influencing the modeling process. These principles concern the choice of modeling concepts, the use of abstraction, the structuring of models, as well as visual representation of the model. We looked at guidelines to describe good practice and illustrate principles with the intention to helping the enterprise architect to create models that suit their purpose and covers the concerns of the various stakeholders.